First issue facing the coalition, without doubt. It's been the most divisive issue in the parliament and within the coalition for a decade. The government's new position won't be settled tomorrow, but this will be an important meeting. It will be where the markers are laid down, where the battle lines are drawn, where we'll get a sense of how hard Conservatives in particular are going to push to protect access to cheap coal-fired power. Coalition MPs say Josh Frydenberg, the Minister for Energy and the Environment, has been working the phones ahead of tomorrow's meeting. Right now, there are a handful who are worried about the clean energy target idea that's been recommended by Chief Scientist Alan Finkel on Friday. Only around half a dozen, but they do include an influential voice in this debate. Someone who's made his mark on this very issue. Tony Abbott took the Liberal leadership from Malcolm Turnbull after a party room split over pricing carbon back in 2009. He then brought down Kevin Rudd after his plans for an emissions trading scheme fell apart. And he then, of course, brought down Julia Gillard after waging war over her carbon tax. Now, today, Tony Abbott has warned this latest proposal for a clean energy target put forward by the Chief Scientist, now being considered by the government, could be seen, in his words, as a tax on coal.
If you are rewarding one type of energy, inevitably that money's got to come from somewhere, either from consumers or taxpayers. And if it's from consumers, well, it's effectively a tax on coal, and that's the last thing we want.
Now, as mentioned, he's not alone. There are a small group within the coalition who are expressing concerns about what's being put forward. Amongst them, Craig Kelly, the Liberal MP, in fact, isn't satisfied with the work the Chief Scientist has done here. He wants all the modelling released, and then he's argued we need further independent reviews of what's being put forward and comparisons with what the energy price here in Australia would mean when compared to the energy price in the United States and in China.
We need to do a bit more homework. The modelling has not been released. Let's get the modelling released. Let's get a couple of other independent organisations to run through the numbers where the Finkel report says we can possibly lower electricity. Let's have a look.
Lower electricity costs.
Lower electricity costs. And also let's have a look at how we stand on an international competitive basis.
So, a lot of these questions, concerns, will be raised in tomorrow's Coalition Party Room meeting. Is it fair to suggest this new clean energy target could be a tax on coal? Danny Price is the Managing Director of Frontier Economics. He did some initial work for Malcolm Turnbull back in 2008 on the emissions intensity scheme idea back then. He also helped the Abbott government develop its direct action plan. Danny Price, thank you for your time this afternoon. The low emissions target, or clean energy target as it's called, let's start with this question. Could it be seen as a tax on coal?
Not in the way that Tony Abbott said. The way that scheme works is it provides subsidies to plants in the same way that the renewable energy target does. And the way that the scheme has been modelled by Alan Finkel, coal doesn't get any subsidies. Gas would only get a very small amount, but renewables would continue to get subsidies. So the way that Alan Finkel has modelled his scheme, it would be rightly thought of as an expanded renewable energy target, but it wouldn't rightly be seen as a tax on coal. It would certainly push coal out, but it wouldn't apply a cost to coal.
So what do you think of the idea? I know you've looked at this in the past. Is the low emissions target a good way to go?
Well, we did look at this in the past, back in 2008. In fact, the New South Wales government had a scheme that ran from 2003 until 2012 that looked very much like this. It was called the GGAS scheme. It was a state-based scheme, and it was genuinely technologically neutral, and it worked very well. It did have problems, and what we learnt from that scheme, we moved on to the emissions intensity scheme as being a superior way of dealing with this problem on a national scale.
Why is it superior? Why is it superior in your view, an emissions intensity scheme, to what's been looked at now?
Well, primarily because what it does is it evens up the field at the wholesale level. So it means that all the action happens at the wholesale level. High emission generators are contracting with low emission generators, and that leaves all the retailers on an even footing. And under the clean energy target, the obligation to buy clean energy shifts to the retailers, and as everyone knows, there's a few small, large retailers, and it puts them in a very strong position in the future. And so it potentially has quite significant competition effects in the market.
All right, so the central finding or recommendation from Alan Finkel, the chief scientist, is that this low emissions target could actually lower power bills, household power bills, by $90 a year, based on the benchmarks that you use here. Do you accept that? Do you think he's right when he says that?
Well, potentially that scheme could deliver lower prices, and so in that regard, Tony Abbott was wrong in terms of thinking of it as a tax, because normally a tax would be considered as revenue raised by the government and leading to higher costs. The way a low emission target works, or an emissions intensity scheme works, is it actually puts downward pressure on the wholesale market, and it can actually lower prices. So we've forecast before that an emissions intensity scheme would lower prices, and we've also modelled before that a low emission target could lower prices as well. So it doesn't increase prices. It definitely will put downward pressure. I think the problem with the Finkel report is that they've only really presented the benefits of a low emission target and completely forgotten to add on the costs of all their additional bureaucracies that they put in place. So the net effect...
Well, that's an interesting point. What sort of cost would we be looking at there, do you think?
Well, so a lot of the recommendations that people aren't talking about under Finkel are all the additional layers of bureaucracy and extra rules and regulations that surround the governing of security in the market. And so the last time we saw this sort of policy rolled out was started back in 2006 with the then Minister Frank Sartor, who upped the standards on the reliability standards on the distribution networks, and that resulted in billions of dollars of costs, the costs of which we're still seeing at the moment. In some cases, in fact, in many cases, it increased prices by over 70% over the last 10 years, and for some customers even more than that. And so,
you said you talk about the bureaucratic cost of having people police what each power generator is doing.
It's not just the bureaucratic cost, it's the cost of their decisions. So it includes sort of a Soviet-era style 1950s planning regime, a central planning, where an organisation who doesn't bear the costs of their decisions make decisions on behalf of everybody. And none of these things are actually costed in Finkel's recommendations. It's just presumed to produce net benefits for consumers. And like I say, we've seen exact same thing in the past, where it's resulted in between 70 and 100% price rises. And I'm desperately worried that none of these things have been tested. And Finkel himself didn't even bother to go through and work out what the cost of all of these recommendations are. They just presume to produce benefits.
So to be clear here, Danny Price, you're saying there's a hidden cost here that the chief scientist has missed.
Well, there's a massive cost. And it's really quite... I didn't know whether to laugh or cry when I saw the report, because normally when you see a study like this, it involves a cost-benefit analysis, and what we've seen is effectively a benefit-benefit analysis. We've only seen the benefit side of the low emission target. We haven't seen any of the cost side of the bigger costs associated with all the extra bureaucratic controls and layers within the industry. And, you know, I'd be very surprised if extra bureaucracy resulted in any better outcomes, but yet that's exactly what Alan Finkel's telling us.
Just because I'm really interested in what you're saying here, the cost there is not just the bureaucratic policing of the scheme, but for each heavy emitting manufacturer, steelmaker, whatever it is, to then have to build into what they're doing the administration of this new scheme. That's the cost you're talking about.
Yeah, well, it's more, even more than that. It's so if we have a central planner who then decides that customers in a certain area need certain equipment to improve security under the new arrangements that Alan Finkel is proposing, this body, the Energy Security Board, would then make these decisions. They're not on the hook for the costs. They would just presume that consumers are prepared to pay for it, and they would impose those technological solutions on consumers. And as we've seen from our last 10 years of bitter history on the cost of extra security, it goes into the cost of billions for equipment to improve security. And I suspect that most consumers would not have recognised the benefits of all the extra costs that have been imposed by jurisdictions who have upped the standards on the distribution system over the last 10 years.
And wouldn't you face that with an emissions intensity scheme though as well, or is that not the same?
So this is so the emissions intensity, the low emission target, is something separate to these set of recommendations. So but on the emissions intensity scheme and the low emission targets, they're very similar schemes actually. If they are set up the right way, they will deliver exactly the same outcomes. There's no difference if it's established in the right way between these two schemes, except for the fact that under an emissions intensity scheme, the high emission generators are basically buying low emission generation, whereas under the low emission target or the clean energy target that Alan Finkel proposes, customers pay for it directly through their retailing, through the retailers. So who pays
is a price
makes
on
a big
carbon.
difference. Oh, there's no doubt
It is a
that
price.
the clean energy target or an emissions intensity scheme or an emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax, they're all prices on carbon. They just work in different ways in terms of the price effects on consumers and the initial incidence of costs. And in the case of the clean energy target, the cost is directly to consumers.
All right, Danny Price from Frontier Economics, I appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you for that. Further to this, and the suggestion from Tony Abbott, you heard Danny Price there dismiss, that this low energy target or clean energy target could be a tax on coal. With me now is the Chief Executive of the Minerals Council of Australia, Brendan Pearson. Thank you for your time this afternoon. Is this possibly going to be a tax on coal?
Well, it's a disadvantage on coal vis-a-vis its competitors, but I think most importantly that we're prepared to work with the government through this proposal, and we have some reservations about it. The Finkel report implied that new clean coal, which is HELE coal, high efficiency, low emissions coal, was above the preferred baseline for the definition of clean energy. Now, we don't think that's correct. We think HELE coal is being used all around the world, and it's a major part of many countries' efforts to meet their Paris targets. And so we would be much more comfortable if the baseline included, as it should, HELE coal, and that would reduce some of that disadvantage.
But just getting back to this question, you said it would disadvantage coal, this new scheme, and we can debate where the benchmark lies, but even if it does include HELE coal, the high efficiency, low emissions coal-fired plants, you're still saying it would be a disadvantage for those coal-fired power plants, but would it be a tax on them?
Well, I don't know about a tax, but just in the same way that under the renewable energy target, those energy sources, which was everything but renewables, they were disadvantaged by the renewable energy target. That's no question. And in fact, over the period, the last 8 years of the RET, not a single baseload coal or gas power station was built. So we've got to be alive to the impact of these disadvantages.
Well, I wanted to ask you about this because, as you point out, there's been no coal-fired power plant built for 10 years in Australia. Why is that?
Well, there hasn't been a gas one built either. I mean, part of the reason for that is, we said to the electricity community, you must have 23% of your generation come from renewables over the period to 2020. There was not much growth in demand, so every new power plant was renewable.
So the renewable energy target stopped coal-fired power plants and gas.
I mean, that's because there was a guarantee.